There is a specific category of person who built most of British colonial infrastructure in the Malay Peninsula. Not free workers, not volunteers, convicts. Men transported from India under the convict transport system, a practice that Britain used across its empire to simultaneously deal with its prison overcrowding problem and supply labor for its colonial construction projects. They built roads, they cleared jungle, they quarried stone, they carried materials up mountains in the tropical heat. They maintained paths and buildings in conditions that free workers could refuse and that contracted labor could negotiate around. Penang Hill, the summit retreat that the British built to escape the lowland heat, was built largely by these men. The paths they cleared are still walked today. The bungalows their labor made possible are still standing. The view from the top that millions of visitors have experienced since the Funicular opened in 1923 was made accessible by people who had no choice about whether to make it accessible. This is Penang Hill, the beautiful part and the part underneath the beautiful. Both of them are real. Both of them are worth knowing. Penang Hill, or Bukit Bendera in Malay, Flag Hill, named for the signal flag that was flown from the summit to communicate with ships in the strait below, is the highest point on Penang Island, rising to 833 meters above sea level from a base that sits at essentially zero elevation on the island's western coast. It is one of the oldest hill stations in Southeast Asia. The British began developing it as a retreat from the lowland heat within decades of establishing Penang as a settlement in 1786, and by the mid-19th century, it had sufficient number of bungalows, gardens, paths, and amenities to constitute a proper highland community, smaller and less elaborate than the great hill stations of British India, but serving the same essential function of providing relief from tropical conditions for the European governing class and their families. Today, it is one of Penang's most popular tourist destinations. The Penang Hill Corporation operates the Funicular Railway that carries approximately 3 million visitors per year to the summit and back. The summit itself has hotels, restaurants, a mosque, a Hindu temple, an English cottage garden, a butterfly farm, and the extraordinary views over the island and the strait that have drawn visitors since the hill station's earliest days. What the tourism infrastructure does not prominently discuss is the specific labor system that built the hill station's original infrastructure, or the history of the colonial administrative and military complex that occupied the summit for over a century, or the biodiversity of the forest that covers the slopes. One of the most biodiverse hillside forest systems in peninsular Malaysia, sitting within kilometers of a major city, maintained partly by the fact that the hill's recreational use created a constituency for its preservation at a time when most comparable forest cover in Penang was being cleared for development. All of that is Penang Hill. Let's go through it properly. Part 1. The hill before the British. Before Francis Light landed on Penang in 1786, before the British established their free port, before the colonial infrastructure began to be built, Penang Hill was simply the highest point on an island that was largely forested and lightly inhabited. The Orang Asli communities who moved through the Malay Peninsula's forested interior, including the Temuan and Batek peoples, would have known the hill and its resources. The Malay fishermen and traders who used the island as an occasional stopping point would have been familiar with the hill as a navigational landmark. The summit's value as a signal point, the original meaning of the Malay name, Bukit Bendera, Flag Hill, was recognized from the earliest days of the British settlement. A signal station at the summit could communicate with ships in the Strait of Malacca and with the settlement at the base, providing early warning of arrivals and emergencies that was genuinely important in an era before electronic communication. The first British use of the summit was military and navigational rather than recreational. The recreational use followed quickly. Francis Light himself is credited with recognizing the summit's potential as a retreat from the lowland heat, and there are accounts of early residents making the arduous climb to the summit on foot through jungle that had no cleared path, along routes that required guides and considerable physical endurance to experience the cooler temperatures. The journey was sufficiently challenging that only the most motivated or most desperately uncomfortable made it regularly.
The development of the hill station, the clearing of paths, the construction of bungalows, the establishment of the amenities that made extended residence at the summit possible required a labor force that could be directed to work in difficult conditions on a steep jungle slope in tropical heat. The colonial administration's solution to this labor requirement was the convict labor system that would build much of Penang's early infrastructure.
Part 2. The convicts who built it. The convict transport system in British India was one of the mechanisms by which Britain managed its prison population while simultaneously supplying labor to its colonial territories. Men convicted of serious crimes in India, and under the colonial legal system, the definition of serious included offenses that would not carry transportation sentences in Britain itself, were sentenced to transportation to the strait settlements, which included Penang, Malacca, and Singapore. The numbers are significant. Between the establishment of Penang as a British possession in 1786 and the formal abolition of convict transportation to the strait settlements in 1873, thousands of convicts were transported from India to Penang. At various points in the 19th century, the convict population of Penang represented a significant proportion of the total population, and convict labor was central to the colonial infrastructure development of the settlement. The work that convict labor performed in Penang was extensive. Road building was the primary task. The construction and maintenance of the network of roads that connected the settlements and plantations of the island required continuous labor in conditions that combined tropical heat, difficult terrain, and the health risks of working in jungle and lowland areas where malaria and other diseases were endemic. Public buildings, the courthouse, the jail itself, various administrative structures were built by convict labor. The harbor infrastructure was partly maintained by convict gangs, and the paths up Penang Hill, the routes that the British needed cleared to make the summit accessible, were cut and maintained by convict workers. The conditions under which convict labor was performed varied considerably depending on the period, the specific overseers, and the nature of the work. The formal legal structure of convict transportation included provisions for remission of sentence, for assignment to private employers who were supposed to treat their assigned convicts reasonably, and for eventual release to a kind of supervised freedom within the colony. In practice, the conditions experienced by individual convicts ranged from genuinely harsh physical labor in difficult environments with minimal care for health or safety to arrangements that were, by the standards of the era, relatively managed. What is consistent is that the labor was not voluntary. The men who cleared the paths on Penang Hill's steep jungle slopes, who quarried the stone for the early bungalows, who maintained the infrastructure of the hill station as it developed through the 19th century, had no choice about whether to perform this work. Their sentences had made that choice for them. The retreat that their work created served the people who had sent them there. The irony is this significant. The British were using Penang Hill to escape the physical discomfort of the tropical climate. The convict laborers whose work made this escape possible were working in those same tropical conditions on a steep mountain without the relief that their work was providing for others. The hill station existed at the intersection of two very different relationships to the same landscape. Part 3. The hill station in its prime. By the mid-19th century, Penang Hill had developed into a genuine hill station community. The summit and the upper slopes had been cleared of primary jungle and replaced with a landscape that was partly garden, partly bungalow estate, and partly the managed forest that the British hill station aesthetic required. Enough trees to feel like nature, enough clearance to see the views, enough flat ground for the bungalows in their gardens. The gardens of the hill station in its colonial prime were a particular achievement. At 800 meters, the temperature and rainfall conditions permitted the cultivation of plants that could not survive in Penang lowlands. Roses were grown, strawberries were cultivated, English cottage garden plants that the colonists were familiar with from home, but that were entirely incompatible with lowland tropical conditions, flourished in the hill station's cooler microclimate. The gardens were a form of homesickness made botanical, an attempt to maintain a connection to a landscape that was 10,000 kilometers away by replicating its plants in the one part of Penang that the climate permitted.
The social life of Hill Station in its colonial prime was the social life of a small, exclusive community. The administrative, military, and commercial elite of the settlement gathered in the one place on the island where they could feel genuinely comfortable. The Hill Station was not merely a place to escape the heat, it was a place to be British in a way that the multicultural, commercially driven, demographically diverse town at the base of the hill did not consistently allow. The hill was, in a sense, where the colonists went to be among themselves. Access to the Hill Station was not limited to Europeans. Wealthy Chinese and Indian merchants who had the resources to build or rent bungalows on the summit also used the Hill Station, but the primary social world of the place was defined by the colonial administration, and the physical infrastructure of the summit was shaped by their specific needs and aesthetic preferences.
Part 4. The Funicular and the Modern Hill. The history of access to Penang Hill is the history of a century-long effort to make the summit more comfortable and more reliable to reach, culminating in the Funicular Railway that now carries 3 million visitors per year. Before any mechanical means of ascent existed, reaching the summit meant climbing on foot, a journey of approximately 2 hours on paths that were progressively improved over the 19th century, from jungle tracks to proper stepped paths to eventually a proper road. The journey was manageable for healthy adults, but it was still a significant physical undertaking, particularly in the heat of the lower slopes. The first attempt at mechanical ascent was an electric railway system installed in 1906. This early system was not reliable enough for sustained operation and was replaced. The current Funicular Railway, which opened in 1923 and has been upgraded and expanded several times since, was a transformation in the accessibility of the summit and marked the beginning of the hill's transition from an elite colonial retreat to a more broadly visited destination. The 1923 funicular used Swiss engineering. The Swiss firm that designed and built it had extensive experience with mountain railways in the Alps, and the steep gradient of Penang Hill required the same engineering solutions that alpine routes had developed. The track climbs 830 meters over a horizontal distance of approximately 1.8 kilometers, a gradient that makes the engineering genuinely demanding and explains why the replacement and upgrade of the railway in 2010, which introduced modern Swiss-made cars with a capacity of 100 passengers, was a significant infrastructure project. The current Penang Hill experience is built around the funicular as both the practical means of access and as an attraction in its own right. The journey takes approximately 5 minutes, and the views during the ascent, over the forested slopes, across the rooftops of Air Edam below, and increasingly out over the strait as altitude increases, are spectacular. The summit station deposits visitors into a complex that has been substantially developed over the past decade, with new food and beverage outlets, improved viewing platforms, the restoration of several colonial bungalows for heritage tourism, and the development of various nature trail connections that allow more adventurous visitors to walk sections of the hill rather than simply riding up and down. Part 5. The Forest, Penang Hill's Hidden Ecological Value. One of the most significant and least discussed aspects of Penang Hill is what it has preserved entirely by accident. The forest that covers the hill's slopes and that continues around the summit in the areas not developed for the hill station and its amenities is one of the most biodiverse hillside forest systems anywhere in peninsular Malaysia and one of the most biodiverse urban edge forest systems anywhere in Southeast Asia. The reason the forest survived when most comparable forest cover in Penang was cleared for development is the same reason that many of the world's urban green spaces survived. Someone with power wanted to keep it. In Penang Hill's case, the colonial administration's desire to maintain the hill station's character as a natural retreat meant that large-scale clearing of the forested slopes was resisted. The forest was managed rather than cleared, which allowed it to maintain a level of biodiversity that is genuinely exceptional. The biodiversity surveys that have been conducted on Penang Hill in recent decades have produced results that have surprised ecologists. Over 200 species of bird have been recorded on the hill, a number that rivals the bird diversity of much larger and more remote forest reserves. Mammals, including leopard cats, slow lorises, and various species of squirrel and primate are present. The invertebrate diversity, insects, spiders, millipedes, is extraordinary, with numerous species recorded only from this single hill. Plant diversity includes species found nowhere else on the island, and in some cases nowhere else in Penang State. The Penang Hill Biosphere Reserve, established in 2021 as part of UNESCO's Man and the Biosphere program, is the formal recognition of this ecological value. The Biosphere designation covers not only the hill itself, but a broader zone of ecologically significant land around it, and it represents a commitment by the Malaysian government and the Penang State Administration to maintain the hill's ecological integrity alongside its recreational and tourism functions. The specific combination of altitude, rainfall, soil conditions, and the specific history of managed rather than cleared vegetation that Penang Hill represents has produced a forest that is, paradoxically, partly the product of colonial intentions that had nothing to do with conservation. The British wanted a cool retreat. The forest that they maintained around their retreat became, over the following century, one of the most important patches of urban biodiversity in Southeast Asia. Good outcomes from self-interested decisions happen occasionally. Penang Hill is one of those occasions.
Part 6. The Hill Today. How to see it properly. Penang Hill rewards the visitor who takes it seriously enough to spend more than 3 hours on it. Most visitors arrive on the funicular, spend an hour at the summit taking photographs and eating, and descend on the next car. This is a reasonable introduction, but it is not the experience the hill has to offer. The summit at dawn is a specific and genuinely extraordinary experience that the daytime crowds prevent. The first funicular car of the day departs before sunrise. Arriving at the summit as the light comes up over the island, the mist in the valleys below, the strait catching the first color, the birds of the summit forest audible in the quiet before the day's visitor traffic begins, is one of the great quiet moments available to a traveler in Penang. Bring warm layers. The summit temperature at dawn can be significantly below what you have packed for if you arrived in the lowland heat. The colonial bungalows that remain on the summit and upper slopes are the most tangible connection to the hill's history as a British retreat. Several have been restored and are now available for overnight stays. Sleeping in a colonial-era bungalow at 800 meters with the views and the cool air and the specific atmospheric quality of a place that has been inhabited for 2 centuries is an experience that the hotels of Georgetown cannot replicate. The waiting list for the most sought-after bungalows can be long. Book in advance if this is part of your plan. The nature trails of Penang Hill are less used than they should be. The Penang Hill Biosphere Reserve has a network of walking trails that connect various parts of the hill, some of which descend through the forest to the base without using the funicular at all. Walking down rather than riding down takes approximately 2 hours, passes through genuinely beautiful primary and secondary forest, and provides encounters with the hill's biodiversity that the funicular does not. Bring proper footwear. Start early before the heat builds on the lower slopes, and carry water. The specific history of convict labor that built the hill's original infrastructure is not prominently interpreted anywhere on the hill as it currently stands. The information boards and heritage displays at the summit focus on the hill's recreational and natural history, rather than on the labor system that made the recreational history possible. Finding this part of the story requires either prior research, which this video is intended to provide, or a visit to the Penang Museum in Georgetown, which has material on the broader history of convict transportation to Penang that contextualizes the hill station's development. This interpretive gap is not unusual for colonial heritage sites in Malaysia or elsewhere. The stories told at the site tend to be the stories of the people who built the site for their own purposes. The stories of the peoples whose labor made those purposes achievable require more deliberate effort to find. The effort is worth making. The view from the summit is more complete when you know what it cost. Penang Hill is 833 meters of jungle, colonial history, biodiversity, extraordinary views, and labor that was not freely given. The convicts who cleared the paths and quarried the stone are not commemorated anywhere on the summit. The bungalows their work made possible are being restored as heritage assets. The funicular their paths preceded carries 3 million visitors per year. The forest they worked in and around has become one of the most ecologically valuable patches of urban edge forest in Southeast Asia. And the view that the colonial administration built all of this to be able to enjoy, is still there, every morning, available to anyone who takes the first car up and stands at the edge before the crowds arrive. It is a beautiful place with an incomplete official story. The beautiful part is genuinely beautiful. The incomplete part deserves completion. Now you have both. Go up at dawn, bring something warm, look at the view knowing everything that produced it, and come back down the trail on foot if you have the time and the legs for it. If this added something, hit the like button, subscribe for more Malaysia content that tells the full story, and drop a comment below. Have you been to Penang Hill? What time of day? What did it feel like? I read everything. See you in the next one.